the last thing we want to have is a successful company and an unsuccessful family. And then at the end of the day, you really got to kind of go with your gut. But if you're looking to make this a career, you have to go outside the company.
All right, everybody, welcome back to another episode of the Success in South Florida podcast. I'm your host, Adam Rossen from the Rossen Law Firm. And on today's episode, we have Michael Lessing, who runs the Lessing's Hospitality Group. Like I said, you guys know I'm not big into the great big grand bios. I always want our guests to just jump right in, introduce themselves, because they can always do it better than I can. So Michael, first of all, thank you for being here, and just tell us a little bit about, who you are and what you do.
Well, sure, Adam. Well, thanks for having me on today. And again, my name is Michael Lessing. I'm CEO of Lessing Hospitality Group. We're a family owned and operated business dating back to 1890. So we've got 135 years under our belt. I'm fifth generation at the helm of the business, and we've got the next generation and the sixth generation already in and working hard, diligently.
Wow, that's amazing. So, okay, we got a lot of things to unpack. 1890, 135 years. Tell us, how did it get started?
Yeah, so it started, my great-great-grandfather, as I said, I'm fifth generation, in Lower Manhattan. We were on the food service side. We actually started in small coffee shops and dinettes in the lower Wall Street area. And we wound up, serving, breakfast and lunch. It was kind of one of the first to do it in the city. We were actually the first to serve Coca-Cola in New York City. So we're really dating ourselves there.
Yeah.
We were kind of centralized. We opened up. We wound up having about 15 of these luncheonettes, mostly in that Wall Street area, Lower Broadway. And it started out that way. We got into our own commissary foods, which meant that we had our own bakery and kitchen down in that area on Jones Street. And we would just make all the food for all the units and send it out on a daily basis.
So this is your great grandfather started.
Great, yeah.
Great grandfather. Now,
yeah,
do you know how old was he?
Maxwell, well, when he started, he was in his 20s.
Okay.
So it goes Maxwell, and then there's Lawrence Augustus Lessing, first, second, and third. And then you got to my generation. So those are I said my father had 5 opportunities to name one of us the fourth, and we are all grateful he chose not to do that. So, but Maxwell got going with it, and then his son Lawrence took it over. Obviously we had to battle through the Depression and everything that brought with it. But they came out on the other side. So they wound up getting into their own, commissary where they made their foods every day. They had the kitchen was set up on Jones Street down in, again, that lower Wall Street area. And then they got into food service where they started serving food. They kept the luncheonettes going and whatnot. And then they started getting into more corporate dining. So they did the New York Stock Exchange and Smith Barney and American Cable. Really some of the real old names. We were inside 120 Broadway, and just kind of kept evolving that brand, and they just kept moving forward, and they got into what was called the business and industry business, which is corporate dining today, and it just kept evolving. And I said we moved around the city. We moved the commissary to different parts of the city as the business grew. The last place we were, in the city was 75 Spring Street, which, is a real hopping spot right now. Back in those days, this is late 70s. It was the Bowery area, so it was rough and tumble. You had Chinatown and Little Italy, obviously just to the south of us there. And I said my father, uncle, that they wound up commuting for over 30 years from Long Island into the city. And as time went on, we got a lot of accounts in the city, and then they actually took a chance. In 1979, they put a bid in on the state park system out on Long Island, and at that time they had what they called the inland parks, and it was all part of like Bethpage State Park is the main one that people would know today, but all the parks away from Jones Beach and Robert Moses were all included. So we wound up winning that bid. And that kind of put us out onto Long Island. We started growing the business that way. We got into our own restaurants. We opened up, my uncle found an old post office cafe, a post office building, and turned it into the post office cafe. And that was about 45 years ago now. And we started to evolve the restaurant part of the business. And then with Bethpage, we got into the catering and concession side. So we started doing weddings and events at Bethpage and Sunken Meadow and other places, other state parks. Montauk Downs was another one that we do. And we currently still run today Bethpage, Sunken Meadow, and Montauk Downs out on Long Island. So, I'd say Bethpage is the one most people will know.
Right.
We were there for 20 years, and then we left for 20 years because the bid changed, and we went back in 2018 for the next 20 years. So, we hosted the PGA Championship there in 2019. We'll be hosting the Ryder Cup there this year in September. So,
that's fantastic.
Yeah, so we got kind of front row seats to that. So that's going to be a ton of fun.
So, Michael, you're fifth generation in the, I guess what we can call the family business, right?
Yeah.
Now, I'm 44 years old, so I think an older millennial. I think, right now I have a 2-year-old and a 5-year-old, so they're not Gen Z. I think they're whatever's coming after Gen Z. So we skipped a generation there, but I'm the oldest in my family, but I have older cousins that are Gen X, right? And so you're fifth and your kids are going to be sixth generation, but really there's about 8 or 9 generations total from, that time period of the 1890s. And as we've seen, especially as I've gotten older, and we know the world changes so much, even in a 10 to 15 year, right? These 10 to 15, maybe 20 year, these generational times, the world changes. So the world has changed 7, 8, 9 times over since your family business has been operating in one capacity or another. So growing up, and I'm assuming you grew up in the business, right? Mm-hmm. This was the family business. So you've probably done every position, right? Any little thing. Have. Right.
The only thing I don't do is cook, but.
Okay. But what were were there stories that were passed down? Were there life lessons passed down? Were there maybe traditions passed down about, hey, well, back when, Lawrence One was navigating us through the Depression, right? Or Maxwell started this. Was there any kind of just like cultural because it is family history, mm-hmm. but cultural family and business history intertwined? Or was it just, let's keep going, let's grind, let's work?
No, I mean, it's the company is definitely, ebbed and flowed over those years. And it's changed. Like when we started the business, I said it started out as small luncheonettes and breakfast luncheonettes and so on. They evolved into what today would be considered corporate dining. And we still do, a large part of our business is still on the corporate dining side. That has changed quite a bit, post-pandemic, as a lot of things have. But we kept evolving the business. As I said, when we started out with luncheonettes, we went into the corporate dining. Then, in '79, my Uncle Jack took a stab at these state parks, which, again, puts you into another sector of the food service business, because
Right.
that's when the catering side started, and there were a lot of concession stands, at the beaches and Montauk and so on. And then we opened up our first restaurant. As I said, that he found an old post office building in Babylon, New York, and he turned it into the Post Office Cafe. He actually modeled it after a restaurant down on Singer Island. We've been vacationing down in Florida, since I guess the mid '70s.
Okay. So you've seen
So
Florida change quite a bit.
100%. I mean, we started over on Singer Island. We had a home over on Linda Lane there. When the Sailfish Marina, if anyone knows that, was really a true galley kitchen. Then it since it evolved in a very big way. But we got into our first restaurant and then started to evolve that. So when you look back at the company today, we're broken into three different, divisions. So we have the food service division, which is our roots. And then we got the catering and special event division. And then we have the restaurant division. And, even within those divisions, there's a lot of, different subdivisions within it. So, I mean, the company just continues to evolve. And we're lucky, they always talk about, family businesses, shirt sleeves to shirt sleeves in three generations.
Right.
You have the group that founds the business, and they're grinding their way every day. The next generation might have it a little bit easier because the founders have ground hard. And then by the time you hit that third generation, things the wheels sometimes can fall off.
They definitely can.
They actually call it the cousin consortium. So, we back in the I guess maybe the early '90s, we had a Harvard group do a study on the company, with family businesses and whatnot. They talked about the cousin consortium because, again, it starts out as one family and then it evolves into multiple families and so on. So we really pride ourselves on the fact that we've, gotten ourselves to 6 generations.
That's an amazing accomplishment because I've heard that in, especially in, I think, Chinese and Japanese culture, I'm trying to remember what book I read it from, but that you're not a real company unless you've made it at least 50 years in business. They're used to having these really old companies in those countries, and in the United States, it's extremely rare to have even a company be 50 years old, let alone 130 years old. So that's it's absolutely amazing. I've never met anybody or known anybody that's had a business last that long. And of course, it changes and ebbs and flows. And right, you guys are probably at certain points reinventing yourselves, right, and pivoting. And there's tons of lessons, I'm sure, in there that we can talk about. But I think it's just it's a really cool accomplishment. How do you go ahead?
Yeah, I was to say, one of the things that we did, when we, back in the '90s, we actually, when we brought that group in, these consultants, one of the things that they recommended was really looking, trying to separate family from the company, which is extremely difficult. I mean, there's 15 family members in the business today, and we've all literally grown up in the business. But what we did do is, we did separate, the corporate side of the business with the family side, and then understood that if there was a family matter that came up, that we actually recognized it as a family matter and then dealt with that off on the side. Because, one of my uncles would say, he goes, the last thing we want to have is a successful company and an unsuccessful family.
Very, very true.
So, I think by kind of separating, church and state of sort, it has really helped the business and helped the family.
And do you think that process of bringing in that consulting group from Harvard was really the big start of that?
I think it is because, again, there's 3 families mixed in to the business right now. And I think it, again, you don't take everything to heart that they tell you, but to have an outside group, that does that, and kind of analyzes, your pluses and minuses, you kind of like listen to the takeaways. And for us, I think it was probably the best thing that happened to us, because from that moment on, there were kind of clear boundaries as to what was family and what was the business. um, and to our credit, we've been able to keep both in a really strong, positive way.
I think that goes to show the power of coaches and consultants. So, like most people who listen to this know, I was a high school basketball coach for 10 years. I still coach the Maccabi games, which is, for those that don't know, the Jewish Olympics. And it's amazing to me, especially how many people are successful in business or doing big things or want to do big things, but then resist coaching or consultants or just think they have it all. And it's something that even younger in my career, right, much earlier in my career, I was a little maybe hesitant. Oh, it's the cost, it's going to be expensive and this and that. But now, I mean, it's an investment for us. So at my firm, we invest in multiple coaches and consultants, and we want people with different point of views, both in and out of the legal space. And that, I think, is one of the best things that we can invest our money in, is just leveling ourselves up and having that outside perspective to just unemotionally and detached look at it from the outside and say, but wait, guys, like because sometimes when you're too in it and it consumes you too much, and you're thinking about it all day, every day, you can't see the forest through the trees. So that's something that obviously you said was such an amazing part of your business's growth, because you guys might have been at that crossroads point, 3 families, what's going on, right? You were at that, probably 4th generation point. And to be able to have some professionals come in and just give you guys some more foundations and
just give you
groundwork.
Basically that unbiased perspective. So it was definitely helpful. Another thing that we wound up doing, like, I'm a homegrown guy, right? I came in, I was going to go work on Wall Street and be in finance. I worked one summer and never left.
Now, did they push you into it, or did they just kind of let you?
I would tell you, my father pushed me away from it.
Okay.
But as I said, I came and just didn't leave. But one of the things we've done with the next generation is we've actually gone and said, listen, here's the deal. If you're working with us for the summer, or you're in high school, whatever, you work your way through, you do whatever positions are available and so on. But if you're looking to make this a career, you have to go outside the company, for at least a 2 to 3 year window in a field that kind of matches what you think you want to do within the company. So my son came to me. He went to Fairfield University up in Connecticut, and he graduates, and sit down with him, and I'm like, so Mike, what's your plan? And he goes, well, I think I like your business. I'm like, my business? What are you, crazy? It's nights, it's weekends. You work when everybody's on. You're off when everybody's off. I said, it's a brutal business. He goes, yeah, but I don't see myself as a desk guy. So, I said, well, the deal. You got to go, work outside the business. So, as I told you before, we have 3 different divisions. So I'm like, and I came up through the catering side of the business. So I'm like, Mike, so what side of the business do you like? He goes, I really like the restaurant side. And I'm like,
it's gonna be working.
I'm like, have you learned anything from me?
Picked the hardest one.
Yeah, I said, you definitely picked the hardest one. So, we had a strong relationship with Danny Meyer in New York City, and so he went and got a job at Blue Smoke, one of his barbecue restaurant concept that he had at the time. And like us, we have to start at the bottom and work our way up. Danny's the same way. You got in there and he had to start basically as a server assist and work his way up.
Nice.
And he spent 3 years there, and he met his wife there as well. So it all worked out real well. I have a cousin on the younger side who started the same thing. He came in, again, worked with Danny Meyer's group, but he went through the Shake Shack side back when Shake Shack was in its infancy. Here's a guy, he graduated, from Richmond down in Virginia, and, he's working at the Times Square Shake Shack for 3.5 years. But, the two of them are great examples of, what that outside influence does, because, they were able to learn things, bring things into the business, that were just extremely helpful. My cousin Lawrence, who started a Shake Shack, he's now our COO, and my son is running our restaurant group. So, they've both done a great job, and really put in a ton of time. They're in the business both around 12 or 13 years now in the family business.
Wow. And I think that's so important because, that the fact that you guys do that, I think, is one of the hidden keys to your success as a company, as a multi-generational company, because what we've seen all too often is, right, second generation or third generation, they're just born on third base. They come in,
Mm-hmm.
and even if they're very talented, there could be a lot of the cultural problems, right? From the team looking at somebody else going, well, wait a minute, we don't think this person really deserves it, earned it, belongs, has the knowledge, or has built up some of the sweat equity. And of course, times have changed and the world's evolved quite a bit since the 1890s. But I think that's still very important to make sure, when people are coming up through the company and have the same last name, that they earn the respect of everybody in the company by working, grinding, doing some of the blue collar jobs, especially at a young age, and being able to say, hey, like, I understand every single role and position in this business because I've done it, rather than just I'm here, and I'm now, next in line to be the top dog. So I think that's very important.
Yeah, no, they definitely. I mean, I started as a dishwasher, and worked my way all the way through. This next generation, kudos to them, because they, the last name just makes it harder for them, not easy.
Right. Yeah. But, we've seen in the shows, whether it's like Succession, or if you, I don't know if you ever watched Arrested Development, back, 20 years ago or so, but there's a lot of those shows that portray those families and the family business, and it's just a complete dysfunctional family. And there's not, the younger generation never earns the respect. So I think the way that you guys do it, and your principles, or maybe core values, whether they're written or unwritten, is something that I can tell that there is that family culture, that business culture within the family, of this is how the way things are going to be done. And again, that's why I think you guys, have been very successful. I mean, I can tell, because those are things that we just, we see over and over and over again. So congrats. I mean, that's really amazing. And the fact to have them go, in a way, it's like, whether it's a superhero movie or something, it's, you send the next generation away to go find themselves, to go develop the skills, to learn with, your people in your industry that are friends of yours, and then they get to come back. And then they're not just bringing themselves, but they're bringing a little piece of those other companies. So I think that's also brilliant. And the fact that you've had a great connection, with other successful, business owners and restaurateurs in the industry.
Yeah, no, it's really worked out really well.
Yeah. So now let's talk about coming to Florida, right? What's the connection? I mean, obviously you guys vacation here. You've been down here in the 50 years, right? But what other connections are there?
So it was interesting, we're very seasonal, being a New York based, company at the time. Our first quarter of the year, that January through March, in New York, is not ideal weather-wise, right? So, our business, especially on our catering side of the business, is much quieter, in the first quarter in the Northeast. So, we had an opportunity.
Your wedding season is a lot different than our wedding season.
It's exactly opposite. So,
Right.
which actually has worked out extremely well. So friends of ours, Charlie Modica, he's his family grew up in the town over on Long Island here, and they he had wound up buying the Rustic Inn, which is up on the Jupiter uh, water there, and we got wind that he had it. I gave him a call, said, "Hey Charlie, what are you doing with the Rustic Inn?" And at the time he needed it for the parking for the Love Street restaurants he wanted to build. He goes, I bought it for parking. What do you want to do? I said, I'll be down this weekend and then we'll take a look. And we talked about it. We looked at it. We at the time 1,000 North was being built across the street, and there were plans to build more restaurants. He already had Utiki and Jetty next to us, and I said, what I don't see here, is event spaces. We run a lot of event spaces, in the New York area, but Florida, for the most part, it's either you're getting married at a country club or a hotel. And there weren't any real dedicated event spaces. So, long and short, we decided I said, I think we need to make this an event space. And, that's what we wound up doing. We worked with Spina O'Rourke as our architects. And, Keith was funny because at the time I wasn't planning on taking what essentially was the entire building down. And we were walking through the building and, trying to move the kitchen around and whatnot. And he goes, "Why are you even worried about the kitchen? This has all got to come down." I'm like, I wasn't talking about taking the whole thing down. He goes, "Oh, you got to take the whole thing down." And, he was right. And we took the whole thing down, and, we built what's just really worked out to be a beautiful ballroom, with incredible views of the Jupiter Lighthouse and the Loxahatchee River there and so on. And, we built Pelican Club, and, it's just been, a huge success for us. And as we were, time went on, Charlie was building the restaurants next door. And I just went back to him again and said, "Charlie, who's going to run the restaurants for you?" He goes, "Oh, I don't know." He's partnered with Joe Namath there. And I said, "Well, we can run them for you." He goes, "Oh, that would be great." So
as simple as that, right?
It was just about as simple as that. And we put it together, and to this day we run Charlie and Joe's. So you got Lucky Shuck and Beacon and Topside, and we run those restaurants for him and Joe, and it's been a great situation.
The Success in South Florida podcast is brought to you by the team at Rossen Law Firm. If you need DUI or criminal defense representation, call the Rossen Law Firm at 754-206-6200 or check the description of today's episode for more contact information. The Rossen Law Firm, helping good people when bad things happen so they can achieve their best futures.
Wow. And so with that experience coming down, and I'm assuming you were the one really, as far as the entire group that was your company that was making these moves, these specific moves, what experience did you rely on in order, to make these deals happen?
Well, a lot of it is gut, right? I mean, I have a great executive committee, we have a great board of directors, we got a lot of talent, between the two. And it's really just kind of like talking it through, putting numbers on paper, making sure it makes sense. And then at the end of the day, you really got to kind of go with your gut. We knew that, the catering side was successful in New York. We know that, as most planes, as they land into Palm Beach International, will say, "Welcome to the sixth borough of New York." So
yep, that's right.
We actually had, some name recognition, kind of instantly, which was, I didn't really play that into the factor, but it actually worked out well. And I would tell you that, we take an ad out in the New York Post, once a year. They do a wedding section in it. And we usually take the center page of it, and it's a kind of a big spread. It's a full color center page. And, as I said, we have a lot of catering places in New York, and it's always played well there. But I would tell you, and I didn't realize this, obviously the New York Post is delivered to Florida, and we got more bang for our buck out of Florida, because it was such a kind of big splash, and it was really more by chance. Because I didn't say, well, let's do this because this will help us in Florida. Didn't even give it a second thought that it'd have any play there. But it really did. And it kind of helped put us on the map.
So that's one of those, right, where you just do what you normally would do for your New York audience, but not even realizing, oh my God, like we're probably the only one that has, a business in Florida here and the name recognition. So it just kind of came out of nowhere. I would say it's brilliant, but you didn't mean to do it. It's great.
Yeah. And we had one page which had the New York places and the other page had the Florida places. And I said, it kind of luck of the Irish, it just kind of worked out.
Right. Oh, that's great. That's great. Now, how did you guys handle COVID?
So COVID caught us like the rest of the world blindsided. I remember having a conversation with one of my uncles about catering because we were getting, pretty heavy on the catering side of the business, as far as the amount of catering locations we had. And I remember a conversation, he goes, I think we're getting a little heavy, in this area. I said, I wouldn't worry about it. There's been nothing, we've survived, everything. And, I'm in the business 40 years now. And I said, we've made it through the Great Recession. We've made it through, up in New York, Sandy, the hurricane was a big deal. Right. I said, we, you get your blips and you hit your bumps in the road. And, I said, it's just, we made it through all of it. And then COVID came. And COVID, obviously we were in the wrong business for COVID.
Right.
The word gathering became, an evil name. And, getting people together, which is what we do at restaurants and, forget the corporate dining because nobody was in work. No one was in schools. We do about 25 schools. That all shut down. So the whole business essentially just shut down. So, obviously, after the moment of panic, we put our hats back on and said, okay, what are we doing? We shut the company down as quickly as possible. And, at the time we thought we were going down, in the New York market, they said we're going to be shut down for 2 weeks,
Right. What is it? And then 30 days to stop the spread and it'll all be fine.
Yeah, exactly. I'm like, what do you mean we're going to be closed for 2 weeks? And, I said, we're heavy in the wedding business. So we do about 2,000 weddings a year. And just imagine that panic, when we're making those first phone calls to people and saying, oh, by the way, we have to move your wedding.
I'm sure the brides were not too happy.
Oh, God. And it's not one phone call, it's 4. Because you talk to the bride loses her mind. The fiance calls up pissed off because you got the bride all twisted. Then the mother calls up and says, what the heck's going on? And then the father calls up.
This is my event. I'm the mother.
Yeah. And then the father calls up and wants to know what happened to his money. So and then you just
Yes.
repeat that over and over and over and over again. And the problem is when it happened, that March 15th, we started moving. Okay. So we moved everybody out to the June, July, August dates that were available and just shuffled everybody around. Then, of course, those dates came around and that didn't happen again. And you had to keep pushing them. And we were pushing people 3 and 4 times. And by the 4th time that you would usually break, and then there was no place else to push them. But it was brutal. The restaurants, they did everything they could to, do the takeout and whatnot. It was just a brutal time. But what we did do is we pivoted into the emergency feeding programs. Up in New York, they had, these shelf-stable meal plans. And we wound up renting a warehouse, bringing in about 150 of the employees back. And we were packing thousands and thousands of meals a day. We had 13 trucks. We were shipping out into the city. And we did that for about 7 or 8 months, where every day we were just packing and sending, truckloads of food out. So it was a completely different model for us. It helped get us, got people back to work. Of course, we had to keep our 6 feet distance, have all your safety gear. And of course, people got sick, unfortunately. And then, in Florida, we were, at the time, Pelican Club shut down, and just like everybody else. But you fast forward to 2021, we were getting ready to open Charlie and Joe's, Lucky Shuck and Beacon, and we opened on February 1st of 2021. And it was still kind of, it's still kind of rolling along pretty good at that point. But the Florida market was extremely different, obviously, than the New York. New York was just locked down hard, and Florida wasn't. And we opened February 1st. The restaurants, we wound up having about all the fanfare, had all the press there, the big opening, blah, blah, blah. And I think it was about 4 days later, 25 people had COVID that worked with us, and we had to shut it all back down again. Get everybody well again. We were back open about 3 days later after that. So it was just kind of on again, off again, really just a brutal time for us. But, the plus side was, we've always been conservatively, operated financially and whatnot. So we were in a good position going into it. So we were able to, manage through, that extremely tough time. It's funny, our PR side wanted to do a story, and they started out the story saying that this is the worst, the company has ever been through. And kind of going back to, remember, we're 135 years.
Right.
And Adam, you led with that early on. And I said, well, guys, you can't really say that this is the worst. And they're like, what are you talking about? I'm like, well, you can't say it's the worst. I mean, think about it. I said, we've been through, the company's been through 2 world wars, the Great Depression, the Spanish flu. Yeah.
Right. I said, nobody knew about until COVID.
I said, so I think you could say that this is the worst our generation has been through. But I don't think you can say, again, when you're spanning that type of time frame, there's been a lot of things that happen along the way. But for our generation, that was by far a brutal time.
Oh, absolutely. So what were the major lessons that you guys learned from COVID, and maybe whether it was New York or Florida, or the differences between the two?
Well, I mean, Florida was a much friendlier market. It never locked down like New York did. I joke, I was in New York for a good stretch, that the early part, because you couldn't get back down because you're supposed to spend 30 days hibernating somewhere. And I said, when I did come down, I joked because it was kind of like I'd been let out of prison. And, I had my mask on. I had my, 6 feet in front of me, my 6 feet behind me. And I remember walking down and seeing Lucky Shuck, and it was like the Wild Wild West. And I'm like, what's with the mask? I felt like I was free again. So it was great to see, the differences between the states there. But, Florida was, in my view, on the right side of all of that. And I think the lesson going forward for the country is, no one's ever going to let them lock down like that again, because we know better now. So I would say that the biggest takeaway is that, we were, always taught to be fiscally conservative. So we were able to maintain, during that extremely tough time. And then, the backside of COVID, when we got to the back end of 21 and 22 and 23 were like just amazing years for us. So
everybody wanted to go out, right? Everybody wanted to
the restaurants, exactly. Everybody was tired of being cooped up. Forget the catering market. The weddings just went off the hook because, we did 200 weddings at Pelican that year, and we only do one a day. So do the math. We were doing weddings Wednesday to Monday, because there was just such a pent up demand. And I said, when we hit, 22 and 23 were just kind of like just huge years for us, because everybody was, back out,
and I'm sure there were a lot of people in all three of those markets that ran on much tighter margins that were not fiscally conservative. So they might have gone out of business. And then were you guys able to gain market share?
100%.
Yeah.
I said, because we were in a good spot, we were one of the few caterers that actually refunded money, because a lot of caterers just don't have the money to do it, and I said, when the music stopped, a lot of people got caught. I said, we were fortunate, that we'd managed it right. There's luck involved in that, but there's also, being conservative. So yeah, I said we actually gained a lot of market share. We were able to continue to evolve in the Florida market, which has really been, amazing for us. Because as we were saying earlier, it's a great offset seasonally to the New York market. We have people that go back and forth that come down from New York for the winter, and then basically do the opposite. And as it gets slower, in the summer months, we have people that can come up and work up in the New York market. So
right. I mean, because there's always been the synergy between the two, and especially in those years 2020, 21, 22, it was another great exodus from New York. My parents, they came through the exodus in around the 79, 80-ish, 1980-ish, from New York, part of that wave. And then I know there's been a few other waves, and then this massive COVID wave. I feel like everybody I know now came down from everybody. I live in Boca. Everybody that I know in Boca that I didn't already know, I'm like, oh, where are you from? New York, Long Island. I came down in 21, came down in 22, came down in 20, COVID, and this and that. And I was like, wow, Florida's grown quite a bit. So.
I mean, we set up a headquarters in Jupiter, so we have our southern headquarters. My wife and I bought a place, right in Jupiter. So we love it. I mean, I said, it's the market's unbelievable. I mean, we've been able to, get a lot of, market share. We run the Kravitz Center down in West Palm Beach now, and North Palm Beach Country Club. We're up in Martin County. So it's just, it's a great market. And we look forward to a lot of growth there.
Right. So Michael, I mean, you took, again, multi-generational family business. There's so many different dynamics there. You get to a part where in the 90s, now there's, it's like mafia in a way. There's the three families, the three offsprings, right, of the different families, 15 people now in it. You bring in these coaches and consultants, and you guys do a great job of just, separating work from the family business aspect of it. Get through COVID. It seems like there's been multiple times through the years where just your companies and the families have been tested. And it seems like you guys are consistently making good decisions, which even in our field, my field, there's most of our clients are good people. Our firm's motto is we help good people when bad things happen so they can achieve their best future. But I've seen over the years that people have trouble consistently making good decisions, especially making good decisions through adversity. So I want to give you, some real major credit to probably you personally, your family, and the company for appearing is that you guys really make consistently good decisions. What advice would you have for people listening to this in any industry? It could be somebody in law school. It could be somebody in business school. It could be somebody who's older and wants to change careers, because, this is called Success in South Florida. So what advice would you just have to anybody listening to this, maybe that's struggling through something right now and needs a little bit of help and advice, or what can they learn from you?
I think, getting advice and listening is always helpful. And I can tell you, in my time frame, we haven't been right all the time. I think, there's things I've done that, didn't work out the way I wanted them to, but it's kind of, what are the lessons you learn from them? And I said, one of the things is knowing when you've, made a mistake, realizing it sooner than later. And making that decision to, listen, this isn't going to work. We need to find an exit. And
So
I think that's something that's a takeaway I've learned along the way.
I like that, because there's a lot of people, there's always the sunk cost fallacy where people just keep going and going because they feel committed because of maybe money or time. They've already put X amount of time into it, but really trying to decide, well, when is it something that's going to be on the verge of finally getting right? Or when is it time to jettison that and just say, we're done, move on? So, okay. I think that's a fantastic.
The other thing is,
now, how do you decide though?
Well, I mean, we have great accounting systems. So, I mean, for us, we're looking at every piece of business we do. We run, true profit and loss statements on the individual business line. So no matter what size it is, whether it's, a big operation or small operation, we have something, we have a stack rank that we follow, and that stack rank will list every operation we have from the best to the worst. The best, you just pat yourself on the back and say, wow, that's awesome. But, where we focus our energy is on the worst, because it's that bottom percent that, it either is not making a lot of money or is losing money. And those are the ones you have to, get your energy on and, turn them around, figure out what's wrong with them, and then make them right. We did a lot of that coming out of the pandemic. A lot of our food service accounts, people weren't in the offices, and they still really aren't. I mean, they're back more, but they're not back 5 days a week for the most part. So
right.
Corporate dining is essentially, for us, over. And there used to be a time we would do a P&L account, like, run it on a profit basis. We won't do any of that anymore. We went back to the companies and we said, listen, here's the deal. You're going to either pay us to be here and cover your costs, or, we're going to have to leave. And, most of them switched over to a subsidy format. And the others that couldn't do that, we had to leave, because, the lesson I told our team was, if we're losing money on an account, we're subsidizing them. And that's the definition of insanity. So
yeah, you can't do it.
No. So
but that's the thing. You guys have your numbers, you know what it costs, you have your SKUs, you have your P&Ls. So that's really important. And you got to have the data, because if you don't have it,
and you have to know your numbers. I mean, I preach it to our team all the time, so you have to know, if you can't, if you can't measure it, you can't manage it.
And these are things that they don't teach you that in law school. Most lawyers don't know. Most of us have liberal arts degrees or something like that. And so these are things that I'm learning quite a bit as we run, Rossen Law Firm. As it is a business. We have 20 something employees. It's a business. So these are things that I've evolved with, and I'm still evolving with, to get better and better at learning these things, because that's not my skill set.
No, but you have to look, I would imagine, I don't know your business, but I would imagine you look at each case that you take and the time that you put into it, and is it worth the effort,
Right.
And I'm sure you guys sit around a table and you have those conversations and say, here's what I have. What do you think? And someone's going to say, I think that's a great one. We should jump on it. And others are going to say, it's going to take too much time and there's not enough reward.
Right. We do now. We do now, but most criminal lawyers don't. It's a bit of a different industry. It's more of cowboy law where, but Michael, I think this is, first of all, you've given so much a great story and great life lessons and advice. Where can, if anybody wants to follow up with you, maybe online or just anywhere, what's the best way for somebody to reach out if they ever wanted some advice?
I mean, they can come back, through our website, lessings.com is our main site, and they can certainly find me through there.
Okay. Awesome. Fantastic. Well, Michael, thank you so much. Again, this was so great. Learned a ton about you, the family business. Great advice. I really appreciate you coming on here, and thank you very much. And everybody listening to this episode has been absolute pure gold, with some great information from somebody who's definitely, you're a lot different than some of our other guests, which I absolutely love. Thank you again, Michael. I really appreciate it.
Thanks again for having me.